I should have known better than to expect anything different. My parents had always made it clear who their favorite child was. My older brother, Daniel 26M, was the golden boy, the one they bragged about, the one they poured their energy into. I was just there, the afterthought, the one they never seemed to fully acknowledge unless it was to make a joke at my expense. But somehow, I thought this time would be different. It was Daniel's big night, a celebration for his promotion at a top investment firm. My parents had rented out an upscale venue, invited family, friends, and colleagues, and spared no expense to make sure everything was perfect. I wasn't surprised. They'd always gone all out for him. I didn't mind. Not really. I had made peace with my place in the family a long time ago. At least, I thought I had. Then my parents got up to give their speech. I expected them to go on about how proud they were of Daniel, about how he had worked so hard to get where he was. That was fine. I had heard it all before. What I didn't expect was for them to turn the speech into a roast of me. It started with small jabs, offhand remarks about how Daniel had always been the smart and responsible one. But then, my mother chuckled and said, "We should have stopped after Daniel. One perfect child was enough." Laughter rippled through the room. My father, clearly encouraged, added, "Imagine how much we could have saved if we didn't have a second kid." The laughter grew louder. I sat there, stunned. I scanned the room, hoping anyone would look uncomfortable, that someone would realize how cruel this was. But all I saw were smiling faces. Even Daniel was grinning. It hit me then, in a way it never had before. They weren't just making a joke. They meant it. I don't remember much of the rest of the night. I know I sat there, pretending to laugh along, pretending I wasn't absolutely humiliated in front of everyone. I know that when Daniel got his surprise gift, a brand new luxury car, I clapped along with everyone else, even though I could barely breathe. And I know that when it was finally over, when I finally got back home, something inside me broke. I had spent my entire life shrinking myself to fit into this family. I had brushed off the favoritism, swallowed my hurt, convinced myself that if I just worked harder, if I just proved myself, maybe they would see me. But that night, as I replayed their words over and over again, I realized something. They were never going to see me. I would never be Daniel. And in their eyes, that meant I would never matter. For the first time in my life, I fought back. The next morning, I confronted my parents. I found them in the kitchen, still basking in the afterglow of the party. My mother was scrolling through photos on her phone, while my father sipped his coffee, looking smug. I walked in, heart pounding, and said, "Do you even realize how humiliating that was?" They looked at me blankly. My mother frowned. "What are you talking about?" I swallowed hard. "The speech. You literally said you should have stopped after Daniel, in front of everyone." She waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, come on. It was just a joke." My father nodded. "Yeah, lighten up. You're always so sensitive." Sensitive. That word. That's what they always said when they hurt me, when they ignored me, when they dismissed me. I felt my hands clench. It wasn't funny. My mother sighed, setting down her phone. "Look, if you want us to be proud of you, then give us something to be proud of." I stared at her, my stomach twisting. "Are you serious?" She didn't even hesitate. "Daniel works hard. He's successful. You're still figuring things out." I had a stable job. I paid my bills. I wasn't Daniel, but I was doing fine. And yet, in their eyes, it wasn't enough. I should have expected it. But somehow, it still hurts. I left the kitchen without another word. I locked myself in my room, sat on my bed, and stared at the wall for a long time. Then I made a decision. I had spent my whole life waiting for them to love me the way they loved Daniel. I wasn't going to wait anymore. If they thought I was a mistake, fine. Then I would erase myself from their lives completely. That night, while they were watching TV downstairs, I opened my laptop and started looking for apartments. I had been living at home to save money, but I had enough put away to get a place of my own. A few hours later, I put in an application for a small, one-bedroom unit in a different part of the city. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. Then I went through my phone and started blocking numbers, one by one, until my parents, Daniel, and every relative who had laughed at my expense were completely gone. I sat back, staring at my empty contacts list. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. This was the first step toward a life where I mattered. where I wasn't just the forgotten second child. And I wasn't going to let anyone, not even my own family, take that away from me. Moving out should have felt like a victory. I had spent years drowning in my parents' favoritism, suffocating under their constant comparisons. Now, I was finally making my escape, but the moment I signed the lease for my new apartment, reality set in. I wasn't just leaving home. I was cutting off my family. It wasn't easy, as much as I hated to admit it. Some small, wounded part of me still wanted them to reach out, to apologize, to say they had been wrong, but I knew better. My parents didn't see me as someone they needed to keep in their lives. They had Daniel, and Daniel, he didn't care enough to notice I was pulling away. Not yet, anyway. I moved out 2 weeks after the party. I packed quietly, mostly at night, when my parents were asleep. I didn't want to deal with their questions or their judgment. On the morning of my move, I woke up early, loaded my car, and walked through the house one last time. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't leave a note. I just walked out the front door and never looked back. The first few days in my new apartment were strange. For the first time in my life, it was quiet. No passive-aggressive comments. No forced family dinners where I sat in silence while Daniel dominated the conversation. Just me, in my own space, with no one to tear me down. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt empty. Not because I missed them, I didn't, but because I realized something terrifying. I had no idea who I was outside of them. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their approval, trying to make myself small enough to fit into their expectations. Now that I was free, I had no idea what to do with myself. A week later, the silence finally broke. It started with missed calls, then texts. At first, they were casual. Mom, hey, haven't seen you around. Everything okay? Dad, you didn't tell us you were moving. Where did you go? Daniel, Mom's been asking about you. You should probably call her. I ignored them all. Then the messages got harsher. Mom, I don't know what kind of childish stunt you're pulling, but this is ridiculous. Dad, you're embarrassing yourself. Stop acting like a victim. Daniel, seriously? You're ghosting us? Grow up. I laughed. They weren't worried about me. They weren't hurt that I had left. They were angry that I had taken away their favorite punching bag. I didn't respond. I blocked their numbers. And for a few blessed days, it was quiet again. Then, one night, someone knocked on my door. Loud. Insistent. I froze. No one knew where I lived. I hadn't given my address to anyone, not even my closest friends. My stomach twisted as I walked to the peephole. It was Daniel. The first stared at the door, my heart pounding. I could pretend I wasn't home. I could wait him out. But I knew him. He wouldn't leave until I let him in. So, against my better judgment, I opened the door. He didn't waste time with small talk. You seriously moved out? His tone was incredulous, as if he couldn't believe I had actually done it. I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. Obviously, Daniel scoffed. You didn't even tell anyone. I raised an eyebrow. Did anyone ever tell me when they made decisions? When Mom and Dad bought you a car? When they threw you a huge party? When they humiliated me in front of everyone? His jaw tightened. You're still on that? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Yeah, Daniel. I'm still on that. He rolled his eyes. It was a joke. I felt something inside me snap. A joke? I repeated. You were there, Daniel. You laughed. They stood in front of a room full of people and said I shouldn't exist. And you thought it was funny? For the first time, he didn't have a response. He shifted uncomfortably. Look, Mom and Dad don't mean everything they say. You know how they are. I clenched my fists. Yeah, I do. That's why I left. Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. This is insane! You're cutting off the whole family over some stupid joke? I stared at him. He really didn't get it. You don't understand, do you? My voice was calm. Too calm. This isn't about one joke. It's about a lifetime of being treated like I don't matter. Daniel shook his head. They're worried about you. No, they're not. I shot back. They're worried about how it looks when their daughter disappears. They're worried about not having me around to take their crap anymore. He sighed heavily. So what? You're done with us? Forever? I tilted my head. I don't know. You tell me, have Mom and Dad ever apologized for anything in their lives? Silence. That was all the answer I needed. I stepped back and started to close the door. Daniel reached out, stopping it with his hand. They're never going to admit they were wrong, he said quietly. You know that, right? I met his gaze. Yeah, I do. And then I shut the door in his face. I stood there for a long time after he left, listening to my own breathing. He wasn't wrong. My parents were never going to change. They were never going to wake up one day and suddenly respect me. And for the first time, I didn't care. I had spent my whole life fighting for a place in my own family. Now, I was finally ready to let them go. This was my life, and I wasn't wasting another second of it begging to be loved. After Daniel's visit, I expected things to escalate. My parents weren't the type to just let things go, but for the first time, I had the upper hand. They couldn't reach me. Their calls? Blocked. Their texts? Ignored. Their guilt trips? Useless. I had removed myself from their world, and they had no idea how to handle it. For weeks, everything was quiet. And then, the letters started coming. The first one arrived in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning. A neatly folded envelope with my mother's handwriting on the front. I stared at it for a long time, before finally opening it. Dear, my name, I don't know why you're doing this to us. Your father and I have always done our best to support you, even if you don't always see it. We love you, and we just want to understand why you're pushing us away. Daniel said you're upset about the speech. I don't know why it was all in good fun. No one was laughing at you. You're just taking things too personally. Please come home and talk to us. Let's fix this. Family is forever. I laughed out loud. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close. It was just another excuse. Another way to make me feel like I was the problem. I tore up the letter and threw it away. A week later, the second letter arrived. This time, it was from my father. Enough of this nonsense. You're embarrassing yourself. Whatever grudge you're holding, let it go. This is childish, and it's time to come back to your family. I burned that one. Then came the third letter, and it was different. Because this time, it wasn't from my parents. It was from Daniel. I don't know why you're making such a big deal out of this, but Mom isn't doing well. She's been crying every day since you left. Dad's furious. He won't say it, but I can tell he's worried. Look, I get that you're upset, but this is family. You don't just walk away. You don't cut people off over something so stupid. Just come home, talk to them, fix this before it's too late. I sighed, rubbing my temples. This was classic Daniel. It wasn't about me. It was about keeping the peace. He didn't care that I had spent my entire life being treated like an afterthought. He just wanted things to go back to the way they were. I crumpled up the letter and tossed it into the trash. They still didn't get it, and maybe they never would. For a while, things were quiet again. I focused on my own life. I threw myself into work. One decorated my apartment exactly how I wanted. I started going to the gym, something I had always wanted to do, but never had the motivation for. And, for the first time in forever, I felt like I was actually living. Then, one evening, just as I was settling into bed, my phone buzzed. A blocked number. I hesitated. Then, against my better judgment, I picked up. And the second I did, I regretted it. About damn time. My father's voice boomed through the speaker. My stomach twisted. How did you get this number? Doesn't matter, he snapped. What matters is that you finally decided to pick up. I hadn't. He had just tricked me. You've made your point, he continued. You're mad. You want attention, fine. But it's time to grow up and come home. I clenched my jaw. I don't live there anymore, I said. And I don't want to. He laughed. A short, bitter sound. Oh, come on. Stop pretending you can do this on your own. You're still that same ungrateful little girl, acting like the world is against her. My hands shook. I forced myself to take a breath. Is that all? I said, my voice cold. There was a long pause. Then, finally, he dropped the act. We need you to come back, he said, quieter now. Your mother isn't well. You know how hard this has been on her. Ah, there it was. The real reason for the call. It wasn't about me. It was about them. Like always. She's devastated, he continued. She says she hasn't slept since you left. Do you really want that in your conscience? I closed my eyes. They were still trying to guilt me, still acting like this was all my fault, like I had forced them to treat me like an afterthought, like I had somehow chosen to be unwanted. I took another breath, and then I smiled, because for the first time in my life, I didn't care. You know what, Dad? I said, my voice lighter now. I think she'll survive. Silence. Then excuse me? I'm sure she'll be just fine, I said. She always bounces back when Daniel's around, right? His breath caught, and I hung up, blocked the number. Then I turned off my phone and went to sleep. For the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. After
Y
that
pues nada, que
call,
había estado
I
estudiando
expected
hasta
my
las 9
father
de
to
la
try
noche, eso
again.
significa que
He
vamos a hacer
wasn't the
6
type
para
to give up
madrugar.
easily, especially when
Sí,
it
6
came
para
to
madrugar
getting
en
his
50
way.
minutos.
But for the next few weeks,
Y
I
espero
heard
que
nothing.
sea
No more
productivo
letters.
para todo el
No
mundo
more
en tu
blocked
vida,
calls.
porque
No more
tiene que
guilt
ser
trips.
obligatoriamente.
For the first time since I
Esto me
left,
acercaría al
it felt
principio de
like they
marzo
had
y
finally
definiría.
given up.
Me está
And
dando angustia de
maybe,
pensarlo.
just
Pero bueno, ya está.
maybe, I could start moving
Estoy poniéndome
forward.
bien
I threw
tan
myself into my
transparente
new life.
porque
I
hoy
started
le he
focusing on
quitado
things that made
a
me
un
happy.
paciente que
I went
no
out
que vive
more.
solo y no
I
se
took
puede
up
limpiar la
yoga.
espalda, le
I
tienen que
made
quitar
new
las
friends,
marcas de
people who knew
bolígrafo
me as me,
de un
not as
test
Daniel
de alérgeno
sister or
en,
as the child my
no sé si
parents
era
never really
pestes, no me acuerdo.
wanted. I even started
Y como
dating
se lo he
again.
quitado con
It
alcohol, me
felt
he
good
quitado
to
todo el
build something
pinchaño
for
que tenía
myself, without my
en
family's
la uña porque le he
expectations
quitado toda la
hanging over
escarcha con el
me.
alcohol.
For the first time,
Y luego
I
de té
wasn't
y
looking
pues
over
así
my
me dio todo.
shoulder, waiting
Era
for the
matar.
next insult
Y
or
ahora ya tienes la
disappointment.
manicura.
I wasn't
Me
dreading my own
encanta el pinta uñas
existence.
transparente,
I
es mi
was just
favorito.
living. Then,
Porque, bueno, me
one
encantan las uñas
afternoon,
naturales
everything came
y
crashing
en
back.
plan, no
I
con
was at work
colores,
when my phone
askreddit.
buzzed. A message from an unknown number.
Y no
At
sé, queda
first,
cookie.
I thought
Así
it
que
was
me gusta
spam,
hacérmela.
but then I saw the
Pero
preview.
bueno, me he hecho
You
un
need to
café
call me.
y vamos a
It's about
darle
mom. I stared
al
at the
primer
screen, my
pomodoro de
heart
la tarde
pounding. I
y
didn't
a
recognize the
este día que
number,
nos
but I
espera
knew who it was.
timer
Daniel. I
con
almost
punta
deleted it without reading the
8.
rest, but something
Tengo
nagged at me.
la
I
cara un poco
hesitated,
rojilla, pero
then
creo que
opened
me
the
susto
full
con agua demasiado
message.
caliente.
Mom's in the hospital.
Puede ser
It's
un problema.
serious. You
En
need to
fin,
come
que
home.
os vaya muy bien,
I
chicos.
should
Mucho,
have
mucho
ignored
ánimo.
it. I
Vamos por
should
el
have
primer
remembered
pomodoro de la
everything
tarde
they had put me
y a
through.
ser
But I
productivo.
was still human, and despite everything, some part of me still cared. So, against my better judgment, I called Daniel back. He picked up immediately. Finally, he said, his voice sharp, "I wasn't sure if you were even going to respond." I gripped my desk. "What's going on?" There was a pause, like he was deciding how much to tell me. Then he sighed. "It's her heart. She collapsed this morning. Dad took her to the ER, and they admitted her. They think it's stress-related." I closed my eyes. Of course. Because somehow, even now, I was supposed to feel responsible. "She's been a wreck since you left," Daniel continued. "You don't see it, but this whole thing has been really hard on her. She misses you." I let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, so now she misses me? Come on," he snapped. "I get that you're pissed, but this isn't about that. She's our mom." I shook my head. "Is she, though? Because I don't remember her acting like a mother to me." Daniel groaned. "Look, I'm not asking you to come back forever. Just come to the hospital. Talk to her. Show her that you still care. Maybe it'll help." I hesitated. I knew what was happening here. This wasn't about her health. This was about control. They had lost their grip on me. And now, they were trying to pull me back and using the one thing they knew I couldn't fully ignore. But I had to be smarter than that. "I'll think about it," I finally said. Daniel exhaled, clearly annoyed. "What's there to think about? She's in the hospital." "I'll think about it," I repeated, then hung up. And I didn't go. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't rush out the door. I didn't let them win. Because if my mother really wanted me there, if she had really missed me, she would have reached out herself. She would have said she was sorry, but she never did. Not once. A few days passed. No follow-up messages. No more calls. I assumed everything had settled. Then, one evening, I got home from work and saw something that made my blood run cold. Sitting on my doorstep was a familiar car. My father's car. I stood frozen for a long moment before I forced myself to move. As I walked toward my apartment, my father stepped out of the car. He looked smaller than I remembered, older, more tired. But the moment he saw me, his face hardened. "We need to talk," he said. I sighed. "I have nothing to say to you." "I don't care," he snapped. "Get in the car." I let out a short laugh. "Are you serious?" He folded his arms. "Your mother is sick, and you're ignoring us. Do you have any idea how selfish that is?" And there it was. The real reason he was here. Not to apologize, not because they missed me, but because I had stopped playing my role. I shook my head. "I'm not going with you." His eyes flashed. "You don't get to make that choice." I crossed my arms. "Actually, I do." His jaw clenched. "Your mother needs you." "No," I said, my voice steady. "She needs control, and I'm not giving it to her anymore." His face turned red. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe," I said, "but it's my mistake to make." We stood there for a long moment, locked in a silent battle. Then, finally, he exhaled and shook his head. "You're just like I always knew you'd be," he muttered. A disappointment. Something in my chest tightened, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I just smiled. "And you're exactly like I knew you'd be," I said. "A coward who can't admit when he's wrong." His eyes darkened, but I didn't wait for him to speak. I turned, walked inside, and locked the door behind me. He stayed outside for a while. I could hear his footsteps pacing and hear him muttering to himself, but eventually, he left. And when I heard his car pull away, I exhaled, because this time, I knew. This time, I had won. I wasn't scared of them anymore, and I never would be again. After my father left, I expected more. More calls, more messages, another desperate attempt to drag me back. But instead, I got silence. A whole week passed, then another, and for the first time in forever, I felt like I could breathe. I had won, or at least, I thought I had, until the final message came. It was Daniel again. This time, an email. I almost deleted it without reading it, but something about it felt different. So I opened it, and what I saw made my stomach drop. Mom's out of the hospital, but things aren't good. She's not herself anymore. She barely eats, barely sleeps. Dad says she cries all the time. He's never seen her like this before. She's been looking at old photos. Keeps saying she doesn't know what she did wrong. Keep asking why you left like this. I know we haven't always been the best family, but is this really how you want it to end? I stared at the screen, my hands trembling, because for the first time, they weren't angry. They weren't blaming me. They were begging. I shut my laptop. I didn't respond, not right away. Instead, I sat in my silent apartment, staring at the walls, thinking about all of it, about my childhood, about every time I was forgotten, ignored, treated like a burden, about the way my parents had laughed at me, dismissed me, made me feel like I was less. But then I thought about my mother crying, and I felt something I hadn't expected, guilt. Not because I had done something wrong, but because, despite everything, I had wanted her to care. And now that she finally did, it was too late. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking, turning it over in my head. Was I being too harsh? Had I been so focused on breaking free that I had become the villain in my own story? By morning, I had made a decision. I needed to talk to Daniel. I called him that afternoon. He picked up on the first ring. Finally, he breathed. I didn't waste time. "How bad is it?" He hesitated. "She's not doing well." She won't say it, but I can tell she regrets how things went down. My throat tightened. "She said that?" I asked quietly. "She doesn't have to," he said. "She's not the same, my name. She's breaking." I rubbed my temples. "And what? You think me coming back will magically fix that?" A pause. Then I think it's worth trying. I sat with that for a long moment. Then, finally, I spoke. "I'll come," I said. Daniel let out a relieved breath. "But," I continued, my voice sharp, "this isn't a reset. This isn't me crawling back. If I come, it's on my terms." "Of course," he said quickly. "Just please, come soon." I sighed. "I'll think about it." And then I hung up. For 2 days, I debated. I knew what I wanted to do, but I also knew what would happen if I went back. This wasn't about my mother. This was about control. And if I wasn't careful, I'd walk right back into their trap. So I made a new decision, one that would change everything. I went back, but not the way they expected. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't drive to their house. I didn't show up with an apology and a promise to forget everything. Instead, I met Daniel at a cafe, neutral ground, a place where they couldn't touch me. When he walked in, he looked tired, like he had aged years in just a few months. I didn't feel sorry for him, but I did feel something. We sat down, ordered coffee. Then, finally, he spoke. "She wants to see you," he said. I sipped my drink. "Why?" Daniel frowned. "Because you're her daughter." I let out a short laugh. "Funny, she never acted like it before. She's different now." I raised an eyebrow. Or maybe she just doesn't like how it feels when someone walks away from her. His jaw tightened. "Why do you always assume the worst?" "Because it's all she's ever given me," he sighed, rubbing his face. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. And for the first time, I saw real frustration in his eyes. Not just annoyance, not just anger, but actual exhaustion. He wasn't fighting for her anymore. He was fighting for himself. Because without me there to be the scapegoat, he had to deal with everything, and he wasn't handling it well. I leaned back in my chair. "This isn't my mess to clean up," I said. "I know," he muttered. And then, quietly, "But I don't know what else to do." I studied him. For once, He looked small, not the perfect golden child, not the family's golden boy, just a man who had spent his whole life trying to be what they needed, just like I had. And maybe, in some twisted way, he was a victim too, but that didn't mean I could save him. I had already saved myself. I set down my coffee. "I'm not coming back," I said. Daniel flinched. "But I'm done," I interrupted. "With them. With all of it." His mouth opened, then closed. And for the first time, he didn't argue. He just nodded. Like he already knew. Like he had known it the moment I walked in. Like, deep down, he had lost me too. I stood up. And as I walked away, I felt lighter. Not because I had won, but because, for the first time in my life, I had nothing left to lose. I walked out of that cafe knowing one thing for certain. I was done. Not just with my parents. Not just with their toxic guilt and manipulation. I was done waiting. Waiting for them to love me the way I deserved. Waiting for an apology that would never come. Waiting for a version of my family that simply didn't exist. I wasn't going back. And for the first time, I felt free. I wish I could say that was the end of it. After I walked away from Daniel, my family just let me go. But of course, they didn't. The final message came a week later. A long, desperate email from my mother. It was different from the others. There was no anger, no blame, no accusations. Just regret. "I don't know how things got this bad. I never wanted to hurt you. I never meant to make you feel like you didn't matter. I thought we were doing the best we could, but I see now that we failed you. I failed you. I just want to talk. Please, give me that chance." I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling nothing. Because here's the truth. If she had written this a year ago, I would have jumped at it. I would have clung to it, dissected every word, let myself believe that maybe she really was sorry. But now, it was too late. Because an apology that only comes after someone leaves isn't real. It's just damage control. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. She had already lost me. And for once, that was her problem. Life after that was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that felt empty. The kind of quiet that felt peaceful. I finally had space to breathe, to figure out who I was outside of being the second child. And you know what? I liked the person I found. I wasn't disappointed. I wasn't a mistake. I was just me. And that was enough. I built a life that had nothing to do with them. I traveled. I took up new hobbies. I made new friends, people who saw me for who I was, not who I was supposed to be. And the best part? I never had to prove my worth to anyone ever again. I was finally living for myself. Months passed, then years. And every once in a while, I would get updates. Through mutual friends, through extended relatives. Even though I had shut the door, my family still existed. And things had changed. Daniel wasn't doing as well as he used to. Without me there, without someone to take all the hits, he was feeling the weight of our parents' expectations. I heard he got burnt out, quit his job, spent months unemployed. And suddenly, the golden child wasn't so golden anymore. I should have felt vindicated. But honestly, I just felt sad. Because no matter how much our parents favored him, he was just another victim, trapped in the same cycle. The only difference was I got out. As for my parents, I don't know. And I don't care. I assume they're still the same. Still trying to control things. Still refusing to take responsibility. Still pretending everything is fine. But that's not my life anymore. I don't have to carry their weight. And I don't have to keep looking over my shoulder, waiting for them to finally see me. Because I see myself. And that's the only thing that ever really mattered. A few weeks ago, I got an email from an old coworker. It was a link to a Reddit post. "When your own child abandons you, how do you move on?" The username wasn't familiar, but the words, they were hers. She was still trying to spin the story, still trying to play the victim, still pretending she had done everything right and that I was just some heartless daughter who had walked away for no reason. I didn't even finish reading it. I just closed my laptop, made myself a cup of tea, and sat on my balcony, watching the sunset. Because I had better things to focus on than a past I had already left behind. I used to think I needed closure, that I needed them to admit what they had done, that I needed them to finally understand how much they had hurt me. But the truth is, I don't need anything from them, because I already got my closure, the day I walked away, and I never looked back.